After the release of Surreal Software's The Suffering in 2004, it wasn't long until a sequel was developed, and sure enough in 2005, The Suffering: The Ties That Bind was released for PlayStation 2, the Xbox, and Microsoft Windows. Again, a mix of third and first person shooting with a heavy emphasis on action and horror, the player once again controls our morally ambiguous death row inmate Torque. Set in Baltimore, Maryland, the game initially has much more of an urban setting, before once again sending the player through sewers, a prison complex, and some surreal nightmarish environments for the game's finale. Now, I shouldn't say morally ambiguous to be honest, because if you played the first game and finished it, you can actually choose what kind of intro the game has depending on your actions in the previous game. And much like the first game, Torque is able to often choose between either assisting or straight up killing various NPCs he comes across, which again affects the ending.
You're done killing for now, is that right? Or are you gonna shoot me too?
It is otherwise pretty much the same as the original game, with just a vastly improved graphics engine that looks considerably better than it did before, showing off a much higher level of detail. Overall, the game's got a higher level of production value throughout, with a lot of the elements of the presentation feeling much more honed, particularly the voice acting. Even Torque himself, who has a few lines speckled throughout cinematics here and there.
Looks like trouble.
Whereas enemies in the first game represented various methods of execution in prison, the enemies in the Baltimore setting reflect Baltimore's criminal history, with creatures symbolizing knife and gun crime, drug dealing, and slavery. It's a neat way to bring the enemies into a different setting, but keep their appearance and behaviour in line with the previous game. The three spirits you encountered in the Carnate prison are now replaced by the spirits of two serial killers, one being a former slave hunter and the other a former pimp. These are obviously the kind of themes that make the game a lot more darker and mature, and something that's probably not ideal for kids, which is kind of funny because I'm guessing most people who played this game when it first came out weren't old enough to do so. Overall, I got a real Condemned Criminal Origins vibe from this game, mostly because of the inclusion of those serial killer characters and the mostly urban setting, which was featured prominently in the Condemned series, another couple of games that were a little bit ugly thematically. Another reason it's probably not for kids is that this is a seriously gory and violent game. I mean, aside from the subject matter of people just being ripped to pieces by monsters, the general level of detail when in combat is pretty violent too. Like being able to literally blow chunks out of enemies with the shotgun, take their head off, or just stain the surrounding areas with blood spatters. Takes that level of violence in the first game and just really dials it up a notch, and like before, Torque can literally be covered in blood after a heavy combat sequence. There's one cinematic earlier in the game where you come across this guy in some apartment building who's committed suicide with a shotgun. The corpse has half his head missing aside from the eyes, which are still attached by the stems to what's left of his brain. And then there's these tiny little spurts of blood that come out of the cavity that used to be his face. Now look, I'm not a delicate snowflake by any means, but I have to admit I was kind of shocked that included something like that. I mean, it's the kind of thing you don't really see in video games, especially in Australia, because our ratings board is such a bunch of pussies who get offended by practically everything. Don't get me wrong, it's not that it's a bad thing, but combined with the various themes and settings, it makes for one seriously messed up and dark game. Now, Ties That Bind does improve a lot of the elements from the first game, but it's also got a bit of a one step forward and one step back vibe as well. For starters, you can no longer hoard away the pain pills, or the zombium pills as they're called, for when they're needed the most. You simply run over them to pick them up. And I don't like this because the game is kind of forcing you to use them on its own terms, instead of allowing you to use them when you might personally need them the most. To make it even worse, they seem painfully absent during moments when you need them the most, like during boss fights you'll get 2 or 3 and you're expected to just hold out for 5 minutes with nothing else. Another big problem is that they've added in a 2-weapon limit, meaning you can only hold on to 2 primary weapons at a time instead of the entire arsenal at once. And this carries across from smaller weapons like pistols and submachine guns through to rocket launchers and shotguns. Now I think they've done this to make the game a bit more realistic, because Torque is actually wearing a weapon holster this time, which he acquires early on in the game. The new guns are at least kinda cool though. You can dual weld Scorpion submachine guns, Colt pistols, and sawn-off shotguns, which just does a truckload of damage to enemies at close range. There's a rocket and grenade launcher, an M60, which is really effective when you actually get your hands on it, and you'll see the return of the shotgun and Tommy gun from the first game, and a grease gun, which offers up an alternate option to the Tommy gun. Obviously they're not all super effective, but the old chestnuts like the shotgun have proven time and time again to be an effective method of ending a monster's existence. And that's exactly how they function in Ties That Bind. Just kind of sucks you can only hold 2 weapons at a time, and all that really does is suck the fun out of it a fair bit. Not to mention, it also severely limits and handicaps you during lengthy gunfights where you're often not given any weapons to fall back on. Most of the time there's some kind of ammo chest nearby or a melee weapon you can grab in a pinch, but I still think this weapon limit is a bit of a detriment. Secondly, whilst I commend the developers for trying to add in new enemy types, a lot of these new inclusions are quite simply just utter pricks to deal with. The Triggermen are bigger variants of the Marksmen from the first game, and these things are big scorpion looking guys with guns for appendages that are just total bullet sponges, and can dish out damage insanely quick from close or long range. Suppressors are legless creatures with Tommy guns coming out of their chests that offer up the closest thing the game has to stealth sections. Now these guys are blind unless you're standing directly in front of a bright light that shines out of their head. When you are spotted, they again dish out a heap of damage super quickly, and like the Triggermen, they're absolute bullet sponges. Both of these types are hit scanning enemies too, and anyone who's watched a lot of my videos knows how much I generally dislike that style of shooting. Combined with the fact that you'll be fighting lots more human enemies, i.e. other people with guns, you'll be engaged in this kind of shooting a fair bit. It's in stark contrast to the combat in the first game, where most of the shooting was you up against enemies that just mostly attacked you with melee weapons. Insanity mode has also had a bit of a reworking. Now in the previous game, using this thing was kind of a last ditch option, especially if you wanted the best possible ending. And yet in Ties That Bind, it's actually necessary to use it to smash down weak walls and kill the tougher enemies. These tougher enemies are called captains, and they often spawn in weaker versions of themselves at the same time as a means to help you fill your insanity meter to take them out. As a result, this mode has been kind of trivialized a little bit. I mean, I always saw it as a metaphor for Torque's inner rage and anger, and the whole point of it in the first game was how it reflected this internal struggle he had between choosing a light or a dark path. Now in the sequel, it's just a superpower. It's more of a gameplay mechanic than it is an extension of Torque's character. And because you often have to use it, it loses its impactfulness and you feel less guilty for transforming, simply because it's not a moral decision if the decision's been made for you already. What I do think is cool though is that as you choose a good or an evil path, you also unlock and upgrade this mode to become stronger, which is at least a neat touch. I found myself playing through Ties That Bind almost entirely in FPS mode, simply because there's more times when you're in combat with other enemies with guns, and just simply because the shooting perspective feels a lot more polished this time around than it did in the first game. And the high level of visual polish throughout the game means it doesn't look as blurry or simplistic when seen through a more zoomed in perspective. A lot of the other changes in Ties That Bind are subjective, and I think it's down to the person playing as to whether or not they prefer the new inclusions or the omissions. Still though, like the first game, the boss fights are atrocious. I mean, don't ever get me started on the end boss. It's also still annoying as all hell how you often get knocked off your ass every time you take a hit from enemies. And quite often when turning in or out of the beast form, for a second or so on each end, you're totally vulnerable to enemy attacks and unable to react, which is just cheap. There's a section about halfway through the game where you're on the back of a truck using a mounted machine gun, which is kinda cool and all, but you're supposed to survive the whole thing on a single health bar, without being given any healing items the entire time. You can get through this part with trial and error, but there's loads of moments like this in this game that show that there was very little playtesting before release, and ultimately the reception this game got wasn't as great as the first game, which led to some pretty crappy sales figures. After the release of Ties That Bind, Surreal Software just kind of evaporated and were never heard from again. It's not a huge issue though, as the game told the story it wanted to tell and at least does end with a sense of closure. But I do think it's one of those game series that could really benefit from some kind of remaster or repackage, bringing the game to a new generation of gamers. Most people who talk about both of these games I think would probably agree that they're definitely unique and enjoyable for the most part despite their issues. Like the first game, Ties That Bind is also available on goodoldgames.com for those interested in checking it out for the first time or taking a trip down memory lane. Both of these games might trip and stumble here and there, but they're both dark, gory and violent and fun where it matters most.